and some meaningful starting points on water as a global issue. In the previous two lectures, we examined both the quantity and quality of fresh water. In this third lecture, we will have a brief look at the expected effects of climate change on fresh water for human use, and we will look at some of the approaches for managing water resources. As we discussed at the beginning of this lecture series, water is a big deal, and it's crucial for our entire ecosystem. And the quality and quantity and availability of fresh water affect all parts of our lives. In addition, there is a close link between water and climate. Obviously, the water cycle is an essential part of the climatic system. In addition, with all the water moving around, the water cycle is also crucial for energy transfer within the climate system. As a consequence, numerous reports have been published on this topic, and here are 3 examples, but there are many, many more. In 2008, Working Group 2 of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, published a special report on climate change and water. This clearly shows that the topic has been on people's mind for a long time. We could probably spend an entire term on the water cycle and the effects of climate change on that cycle. What we're going to do here, though, is just give a brief overview of some of the expected effects. In general, warmer temperatures mean that there's more energy to evaporate water, and the atmosphere, because it's warmer, can also hold more water. And what goes up in the atmosphere also has to come down. So the overall water cycle will just become more intense. So here's what climate models say about the expected effects on the water cycle. Specialists expect that precipitation to increase in the high latitudes and parts of the tropics and decrease in some of the tropical and mid-low latitudes. Vancouver is located in what's known as a high mid-latitude, so the signal for what's going to happen in Vancouver actually isn't that clear just yet. Specialists also expect that precipitation intensity and variability will increase. In other words, whether it rains or doesn't rain will become more variable, but when it rains, it will pour. As a consequence of this change in the cycle, we have the risk of flooding going up because when it rains, it just deluges, and also the risk of droughts will go up because these big rains will become less predictable, more sporadic, and more intermittent. Because of the higher temperatures, the winter seasons will get shorter. Glaciers will keep melting away. In the long term, this has serious consequences on water availability because the snowpack and the glaciers are a key source of water during the summer months, especially in areas that would be otherwise dry throughout the summer. In Canada, this is concern for Alberta and Saskatchewan, but also applies to many other regions around the world. As a consequence of both the changes in precipitation patterns and the amount and timing of the water stored in the snowpack and glaciers, river runoff is expected to change. While the high latitudes and some of the tropics will see increased runoffs, some of the already dry mid-latitude areas will see lower runoffs. These areas include the western United States, which has been suffering under drought conditions already. It will also occur in southern Africa, which we already discussed when we talked about areas like Cape Town and the drought that they had. As well, there will be areas that suffer drought conditions in the Mediterranean, in Europe, and in northern Brazil. Specialists also expect that the warmer temperatures will have a negative effect on water quality and water pollution because bacteria and pathogens will just grow faster in the warmer water. This is a graphic from the United States Environmental Protection Agency, the US EPA, that illustrates the expected changes for the United States in a very approachable way. In general, there will be hotter and drier conditions in the western interior, and hotter and wetter conditions in the northeast and along the coasts. Now, as always, the expected changes will produce some winners and some losers. Growing conditions, for example, will improve in some areas, but get worse in other areas. But overall, it's expected that these changes will have a negative effect and outweigh any of the potential benefits. What you see on this slide is the expected effect of water availability in the short term. The two maps contrast the conditions in 1995 and 2025, which of course 2025 isn't very far away. Withdrawing more than 20% of the total replenishable fresh water is considered excessive use of the existing water resources. These countries that will be doing this are shown in yellow. Countries shown in orange extract even more than 40% of the available water. When you look at the two maps, you can clearly see that the number of countries with excessive water withdrawals is increasing substantially, and the situation is worsening in many countries. For example, both the United States and China are projected to extract more than 20% of the available fresh water by 2025. India and South Africa, which are already extracting more than 20% in 1995, are projected to extract more than 40% in 2025. So overall, it's expected that by 2025, about 2/3 of the world's population could be living under water-stressed conditions. With the existing climate change scenarios, it's expected that by 2030, and again, that's not very far away, almost half of the population of the world will be living in areas that are under high water stress. So there will still be enough fresh water globally But again, its distribution will be what's challenging, and that distribution of available fresh water will change from what it is currently. Overall, this means that people who already live in arid places will likely be displaced. Estimates for the water-related displacements of people in the foreseeable future range from 24 to 700 million people, which is up to 10% of the current world population. Now, migrations of this magnitude are hardly ever smooth and peaceful. Accordingly, there's considerable potential for international conflicts because of all this water stress. Water-related conflicts have a long history and continue to be a global and regional problem. What you see on this chart is the number of water-related conflicts per year between 1931 and 2012. Now, the spike in 1943 is related to the Second World War, but other than that, you can clearly see the increasing trend in the early 2000s. Let's look at a few examples of the situations that have the potential to lead to these types of conflicts. The Ganges, the Brahmaputra, and the Mekong rivers, together one of the largest freshwater flows in the world, all pass through Bangladesh on their way to the ocean. While the Bangladeshi agriculture critically depends on this water, the headwaters of these rivers are actually in India and China, who also as countries have their own needs for their people. Given the pressures on their own populations and economic growth, India and China will be looking out for their water and hydroelectricity needs, and all of this, with the diversions and use of water, will put the agriculture of Bangladesh at risk. Climate change will make the situation even worse because India and China might go ahead with dam projects to retain at least some of the water which is getting lost with the melting of the glaciers in the Himalayas. The vulnerability of Bangladesh is fairly obvious. You can see that it would be very difficult for Bangladesh to push back against these much more powerful nations. To tie back to the earlier topic, the consequences of water use of India and China is an good example of a transboundary externality that we talked about before when we were talking about market forces. A similar situation closer to home is the Columbia River, which flows through some of the most arid regions in North America, including Colorado, Utah, and Arizona. The water from Colorado is used extensively for agriculture. It is the major water source for cities and farms all through Southern California, where there are huge populations. But as you can see on this map, the Colorado River actually goes through Mexico before it reaches the Pacific Ocean. Now, at this point, where it gets to Mexico, the Colorado actually does not flow to the ocean anymore because all of the water has been extracted. This has serious consequences on people and the environment along the dry sections of the Colorado. So this is another example where water issues can lead to potential conflicts due to transboundary externalities. Let's talk a bit more about water resource management, and let's start by putting it in context of climate change management in general. In the discussion that we had about climate change politics, we distinguish between mitigation of and adaptation to climate change. Mitigation refers to reducing the intensity of climate change, whereas adaptation describes the adjustment to these expected changes. In the simplest terms, we can recognize that mitigation is closely tied to our energy system. Reducing the intensity of climate change requires us to decarbonize our energy system. In other words, we need to get away from burning fossil fuels for our energy needs. A big part of our adaptation to climate change will be the adjustment of our water infrastructure so that we can deal with the changing water conditions in a meaningful way. So, what are our options for approaching this challenge? There are two main options for managing water resources. There is the supply side of management that seeks to find new water sources, and there is the demand management side, which aims to use the existing water resources more efficiently. Both approaches, the supply and the demand sides, try to close the gap between the locally available water and the existing human demand. So let's look at a few examples of different management approaches. Sometimes there's enough water in a location, but it simply does not arrive at the right time. A good example for this situation is Vancouver. We get most of our water delivered in the wintertime with the big storms coming through, but the water demand is highest during the summer months, which are typically much drier. Now, a big part of the winter precipitation that we receive is stored in the snowpack on the local mountains and released slowly during the spring and the early summer as the snowpack melts. But we only have very limited control on when exactly this water is released because it depends on the temperatures in the spring and the summer. Building dams is an engineering solution for achieving the same thing, but with much more control. The dams are filled over the fall and winter months and then slowly drained over the summer as we use the stored water. The key is to have enough storage capacity so the available water can cover the demand over the entire summer. This generally works in Vancouver, but there have been a few summers recently when we had water restrictions to make sure we do not run out of water before the fall storms arrive. Now, dams are a fairly straightforward solution, but there are challenges with them. There are only limited places you can put dams. There are environmental concerns as you are flooding entire valleys upstream from the dam. And in big projects, there are also social issues. The Three Gorge Dam in China, for example, displaced more than 1 million people before the valley was flooded. Another potential issue is that water is available, but in the wrong place. Importing or diverting water is a possible approach for managing this issue. The California State Water Project, which was started in 1960, is an excellent example for this supply management approach. This network of dams, aqueducts, pumping stations, and power plants collect water from the rivers of Northern California and redistributes the water to the water-scarce but highly populated areas of Central and Southern California. About 70% of the diverted water is used in urban areas and for industrial use, and 30% is used for irrigation. However, there are considerable environmental and ethical challenges associated with diverting large amounts of water across the land. One example of this in California is that there is much controversy about water being diverted from northern areas and losing the potential to grow food, and this water is diverted down into Southern California, places like Los Angeles, where people then use the water just to water their lawn so that their grass stays green during the summer. So there are lots of examples where there's controversy about these diversion projects. The last supply management approach that we will touch on is desalination. Desalination enables us to turn salty seawater into fresh water, and there are two main methods for desalination. Distillation, where you evaporate salt water, capture the steam, and reverse osmosis, where you force water through a semi-permeable membrane that separates the water from the salt. In total, there are about 7,500 desalination plants in the world. 60% of these are in the Middle East. The world's largest desalination plant is located in Saudi Arabia, which produces approximately 500 million liters of water every day. The issue with desalination is that it is incredibly expensive, energy intensive, and the remaining brine is considered toxic waste. So the approach is really only feasible if you can power it with renewable energy, for example, solar energy, which in fact is abundant in the Middle East. Let's summarize the different approaches for supply management. We can build dams to address the issue of timing, divert or import water to deal with the issue of having water in the wrong location, use desalination to tap an ocean as a new water source, and I didn't mention this approach before, but we can recycle water by extracting clean water from wastewater. Now, this might sound a bit challenging or maybe even a bit disgusting, but this is exactly how water is recycled on the International Space Station, because this minimizes the need for continuously flying new water up to this closed system in the space station. Because there are limits to tapping new sources of water, supply management often has to be complemented with demand management to bring the need for water down to a level that it can be covered by the existing supply. To structure our discussion of demand management, we can use the old IPAT framework again. Demand management approaches primarily target affluence or the technology part of this equation. This is how Cape Town tried to encourage their citizens to preserve water by developing new social norms. To avert reaching the day zero, where they would run out of water, Cape Town wanted to bring the water consumption down by 50 liters per person per day, which is about 1/5 of what we use in Canada. Another possibility for affecting affluence is to put a price on water. Water is a global commons resource with open access issues, which naturally leads to overuse. Some economists, therefore, suggest that putting a price on water is a possible solution. In other words, they suggested privatization, just like Harding did in his paper about the tragedy of the commons. However, there are serious ethical concerns about water pricing. Water is essential for life and therefore a human right, not a commodity. There are also a number of practical and policy issues associated with the implementation of water pricing that we don't have enough time to go into detail here, but really are interesting and give you some insights into how complicated this situation is. Of course, there are also a wide range of technical solutions for demand management. This slide lists just a few, including drip lines that have made irrigation much more efficient, or the development of new types of crops that need less water to produce the same yield. Overall, modern water management practices are well established, and if managed properly, there is enough water around in most circumstances. However, there is often a lack of political will or capacity to change existing practices and implement new management approaches. So often it's more of a management problem than a resource problem. To address this issue, we need social science that examines people's perceptions and attitudes so that we can design water management policies that resonate with people in order to get their support. To assist in these complex management issues, SFU has the Pacific Water Research Center, which I mentioned earlier, and it conducts research on many of these related topics. It really is a really interesting unit, and if you're interested in water resource challenges, you definitely should check them out and meet with some of the members of that group. There are also a number of upper-level courses on water and water-related to issues related to security. Let's finish this series of lectures on water by summarizing the main points. Overall, there is enough fresh water available to cover human needs, but the problem is that the available water and water use is not currently distributed evenly across the planet. This means that we can have areas with local water scarcity, which can be due to physical reasons, for example, nature not providing sufficient water, or for economic reasons, when the infrastructure is not up to the task. Now, water is only useful when it is clean and safe for consumption. So in addition to quantity, quality also matters a great deal. In 2015, approximately 9% of the world's population still did not have access to clean, secure drinking water. Climate change will have a significant effect on the water cycle and the availability of fresh water. We touched briefly on the fact that water management will be a big part of our adaptation to climate change, whereas decarbonizing the energy system will aim to reduce the intensity of climate change. So that's a mitigation strategy. Substantial changes in the availability of fresh water will likely lead to mass migration, which often is associated with conflicts. Last but not least, we looked at the different approaches for managing water issues. We saw that solutions do exist, but implementing these solutions can be challenging. Unfortunately, it's difficult to change the use pattern of a society without extensive pressures to make those changes. Hopefully, we will have enough time to adjust in a meaningful way once the changes are at our doorstep. Or even better, hopefully, we will